Hi, everybody. Welcome to Listen In with Radiotopia and the Over the Road team. We're so happy to see you all and have you here with us today. My name is Audrey Martovich. I'm the network director of Radiotopia, and I'm joined here by my colleagues, Aaron Wade, producer for Radiotopia and digital producer for Ear Hustle, and Marielle Carricker. She's the marketing coordinator for Radiotopia. And also I'm joined by our executive producer for Radiotopia and for Over the Road, Julie Shapiro, who is going to be in conversation with the full Over the Road team today. And so we've been doing these listen-ins as really a way to gather together, people who are making shows and also listeners to get together, really just to listen to amazing audio and to dig into it a little bit more together. And so we've brought we've brought a few different Radiotopia producers in the past, but we're also like trying to have conversations with people who are beyond the shows, people who are thinking and writing about audio as well. Today, this is a really special event. We're marking sort of the end of Over the Road. And so, keep an eye out on all of the different Radiotopia social channels for more information about events like this. But for now, thanks again so much. And I'm going to just kick it right over to Julie Shapiro, executive producer.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It is such a pleasure to get the team back together for this event. And to be joined by all of you from all over. I just want to say we know there is a lot on people's minds right now, including ours these days. And it's hard to know exactly where to spend and give your energy, but we're really glad that you're here with us today for the next hour of your afternoon or evening or morning, whatever time it is for you. As Audrey said, I'm Julie. I'm the executive producer of Radiotopia and served as executive producer on this show, Over the Road. And I am joined by the team. We have long haul Paul Marhoefer, we have Todd Dills from Overdrive Magazine, we have Lacie Roberts from Transmitter Media, and we have lead producer and sound designer and general keeping us on tracker, Ian Coss, who will all be joining me for the conversation in a second. We're going to talk about the making of the podcast and then listen to some of our favorite clips and share them with you. And then we're going to take some questions at the end about trucking, about podcasting, about things in between. But first, I just wanted to mark the moment by sharing a little bit about the origin story of Over the Road, because you don't always get the opportunity to do that and talk to people who tuned into the show and tell them about the beginning. And because we're storytellers, that's what we do. So I can't resist, in fact. Over the Road is actually the first podcast produced internally by Radiotopia. In my role as an executive producer, I'm generally in the position to support the other producers in the network. But this idea was actually something that I had thought about for a very long time. I've worked very closely with the Ear Hustle team since that show started. If you don't know, that's a podcast about daily life in prison and what happens when you get out. And it's made by a team of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people collaborating with producers. And they're from San Quentin State Prison. And in that work, I have really learned the value of sharing stories from within a community, as opposed to telling stories about a community. After Ear Hustle found its way, I started thinking about other topics or subcultures or communities that you could share these stories from in a similar way from the inside. And trucking for me has just always been a genuine interest. I grew up in Northeast Ohio, near a trucking hub off the highway. I did a research project on trucking culture while getting a sociology degree in college. I've had so many questions for years and probably many misconceptions. And whenever I mention the idea of the show to anybody, there's always immediate interest, whether they're connected to trucking or not. So I really began to trust that there was an audience out there that would appreciate this content, a show about trucking, both those connected directly to the industry and those completely unconnected to the industry who wanted to know more. And maybe we could bring some new listeners into Radiotopia through this show as well, which with my EP hat on, I'm always thinking about. Importantly, I always imagined that this would be a really rich sounding show because there would be so many sounds to work with, from the musical to the mechanical, sounds from the trucks, sounds from the roads. And so for me, this was a perfect audio project to venture into. But back to Ear Hustle, one of the reasons why that show has had such an impact on all kinds of listeners from all over the world is because the people making it have personal expertise in the subject matter. And there's an authenticity that comes with that, a connection that listeners make. And that's an authenticity I wanted to bring to this show. Obviously, I have no personal experience or knowledge about trucking, so we clearly needed some help with it. Enter Todd Dills, an old friend of mine from Chicago and senior editor at Overdrive Magazine, which is a newspaper and website for owner-operators in the trucking biz. Now, here's someone with knowledge. By chance, I found myself in Nashville back in September 2018 for a conference and was catching up with Todd and his wife, Susanna, over dinner. And by the end of the meal, I had flat out pitched him the idea of collaborating on a podcast. It wasn't premeditated, it was sort of spontaneous, but also felt kind of preordained all along. I don't know if that makes sense, but looking back, it does to me. Todd was immediately interested, and when I said that, of course, the show would hinge on finding the perfect driver host, I'll never forget him saying, "I've got your guy." Enter Paul Marhoefer, musician, writer, troubadour of the road, long haul Paul, who you all know well by now, who had worked with Todd at through Overdrive. So I talked to my team at Radiotopia and PRX. Todd went back to Overdrive and talked to his colleagues. Paul spoke with his employers at Moeller Trucking, and everyone approved the collaboration. I ended up reaching out to Ian, who I'd worked with before on a couple of Radiotopia projects and knew would just be a great match for this show. And 5 months later, podcasts take a long time. 5 months later, we met up in Boston to start dreaming up this show. That was March 2019. And I think we've spent at least half of that time trying to think of a name, which we were not successful in that meeting. Naming podcasts also very hard. They take a long time and it's hard. Not long after that, Ian suggested that we bring Lacie on board, Lacie Roberts, a producer who he had worked with before, from a multi-generational trucking family in Montana. So with Lacie and my wonderful colleagues at Radiotopia, who were going to help us market, promote, design the show, all the other things you have to do when you're launching a podcast these days, the team was complete and we got to work. So now we're like 15 plus months later, and after that first in-person meeting, we've released the entire series during a pandemic. We produced 8 sound-rich and narratively complex episodes, 7 mini episodes or Channel 19s that Todd took the lead on, and 3 updates from the road, giving some firsthand perspective from Paul on how COVID was affecting drivers. And our fellow Radiotopians helped promote the show. We've heard from drivers and trucking industry executives and four-wheelers, that's us car drivers, who have loved the show, people who told us they never expected to care about a trucking podcast, people from other countries who really appreciated this lens on American culture and society right now, sons and daughters of drivers who told us they could hear their stories and their parents' stories in these episodes. And we've heard from so many listeners who told us they will literally drive down the road thinking about the trucks and the truck drivers that they're passing or that are passing them differently now. Of course, we also heard from lots of Paul fans who loved his voice and his writing and his music. So there's a lot more to say, but I really want to bring the team in. My last thought is simply that I'm so proud of the work we've done and the impact that I feel it's had on our audience. It's been such an honor to work with this team of incredible creators. Really one of my professional and personal highlights of my career so far. So with that, let us start talking to the full team, and I'm just going to throw some questions out, and let's see what y'all have to say. Todd, let's start with you. Can you talk about why this idea was kind of immediately interesting for you, and then why you think your Overdrive colleagues also felt like it was a good partnership to enter into?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting for a number of reasons, two of which you've already described, and basically that's because of my personal connection to you and the fact that I knew Paul, and I had a good feeling about him doing this thing, perfectly, right? So, but in terms of Overdrive and Overdrive's audience, we tend to, we're trade magazines, so we write to folks in the trucking industry. And, you know, a lot of what we end up doing ends up being a lot of inside baseball when it comes to the concerns that truck drivers have. In our particular case, it's owner operators, folks who are you know, own the trucks that they drive, and you know, have a real investment in the business other than just the work that they do. When folks talk about what they care about, a lot of what I hear is a kind of I don't know. There's like a disappointment that, you know, what they care about just never falls on the ears of people who are outside of their own industry. And so what it ends up being, and people use the phrase "preaching to the choir" a lot, and when they talk about kind of the some of the advocacy like reporting that we might do, you know, that we do news and everything else. But so this project, knowing the reach of Radiotopia, and you know, and the reality that the network, you know, gets out to a wider audience in a big way, that appealed to me in that regard. And everybody at Overdrive, really, it's just like a chance to give voice to some of the reality of trucking, you know, the issues that folks are concerned about, but also just, you know, the culture that's there, and just give people a better understanding of, you know, who does the work and, you know, what they care about. So.
Yeah, I should have also said, so Todd served as like a kind of editor on the scripts and helped shape the story. And then also took the lead on these Channel 19 series, which we put out between the episodes, where they were sort of shorter, more compact things where we answered listener questions and went deep into just single stories most of the time.
Right.
Cool, thanks.
I'll say, Julie, you actually said it earlier a lot better than I think I did in terms of what I was hopeful to get out of this, and it's that that the four-wheeler driving down the road, passing a truck, and thinking about the truck they're passing in a new way, you know, in a more meaningful, kind of deeper way, and that extends to sort of safety and you know, just appreciation of other people generally. So
yeah. Awesome, thanks.
Yeah.
Paul, let's turn to you next from the seat of your truck. And I wonder if you could just recount for us, when Todd first approached you with this idea of hosting this podcast, you know, what were some of your initial thoughts about why you were interested in doing it? And then I think on the other side of the podcast, are there any major takeaways you've learned from the process? You know, what are you thinking about now in terms of the storytelling mode and the experience with the show?
Well, Todd, first of all, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks so much, Julie, for all you've done. Todd came to the truck stop and met me. I had just come out with an album, and he asked, you know, where do these songs come from? And I told him my dad was a Chicago guy who loved Studs Terkel. And you know, my dad was one of those guys who would retire from dinner and go to his blue Herman Miller chair and read for the rest of the night. And so you kind of picked up on that through osmosis. And you know, he would say like Studs Terkel celebrated the common man. And I told Todd I was down in Pompano Market one time and listening to these stories, and like these stories that these old truckers would tell. A lot of them were Vietnam vets. It was like something out of a Flannery O'Connor short story. It was really gritty, riveting stuff with some moral ending. And I just thought, man, if only Studs Terkel was here, you know, he could record these people. But Studs Terkel was dead, and so it was up to me to write the song from these stories that I thought were so rich and meaningful. And I think Todd let you listen to that interview, if I recall correctly, and you were a big Studs Terkel fan, and I think that's kind of where that whole thing started. And then Todd said, well, have you ever heard of Radiotopia? I said, well, yeah, and you know, we were talking about podcasting. And, well, yeah, I love the medium because I listen to channel 123 a lot on satellite radio, PRX Remix, and I love the Kitchen Sisters. I mean, to me, they were doing sonically what Studs Terkel was doing in print, you know, layering these stories. And there's very little narration from the Kitchen Sisters. They were just layering these stories. Like, I used to listen to Cry Me a River. Cry Me a River is like an album, you know, that I've listened to over and over again. And so I said, yeah, I love the medium. Sure. It wasn't something, you know, the thing about the music world, you scratch and you claw, and then 3 or 4 years later, you get past the dreaded less than 1,000 downloads thing on Spotify. But this was a different kind of thing. Would you be game to doing this? Yeah, yes, I think I would. Mm-hmm. And as far as the process, you know, I used to say, if you want to know what your personal demons are, walk into a studio with your friends and commit yourself to a sound recording. And you know, there were times when, you know, breaking in with this team was like breaking into a set of Red Wing shoes. It was painful at first, but then it got really comfortable. And I think you guided us through that, Julie, and Ian, beautifully. So that's what I got on that one.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I think it was a process that we all went through together and learned about how to come together and share these deeply, deeply personal stories from you and from the friends who you reached out to and the other drivers that we included in the series. Speaking of very personal stories, I wanted to hear from Lacie Roberts next, because she came on board as a producer and also did some reporting with Paul and did a whole episode that was about her family, very personal. So Lacie, thank you for joining us on the day that you're actually moving across the country. Very appreciated. And, you know, I think this email from Ian, I imagine, came kind of out of the blue for you, but I wonder, you know, kind of the same question. What was in it for you? What were you hoping to get out of the experience of bringing your perspective to the show?
Yeah, well, thanks, Julie, and thanks for everyone. It's so cool to see. There's 88 of you here. Wow. Yeah, it was a little out of the blue. I had worked with Ian before on a show called Closer. Just gonna plug it, Closer Than They Appear. It was a really wonderful show. You should all check it out. And it was sort of a dreamy email to get. You know, I'm from Montana, and I had not long before moved to New York City. I moved back to the East Coast after, the first time I'd been to the East Coast was when I turned 18. And that was like when I realized that like everybody doesn't live the same lifestyle that I did like in Eastern Montana. I was like, I live a very specific world and context in life. And the stories that I hear told in my family are not the stories I hear told in anywhere else. And when I would share these stories, like with, you know, new friends on the East Coast, they'd be like, what? Like, what? I can't believe, you know, they would have a lot of questions. And it was so weird to me. They thought it was so weird. And that's really when I started wanting to be a journalist, because I wanted to bring those kinds of stories to a wider audience. And I, you know, over the, you know, following 15 years or so, I, you know, hadn't really gotten to do a lot of that because you get sort of funneled and put on tracks. And I wasn't living in Montana anymore. And I was in California, and then I was in New York. And so this email was sort of like, oh my gosh, here's like a chance to do the thing that I've been wanting to do my entire career. And, you know, I think it's something that me and Ian had talked about too, you know, over beers one night after work. So it was just, yeah, it was really a dreamy email to receive. And it was really, really easy to say yes to. And I'm so honored to have worked with this team. I think that the thing that I wanted to get out of it is to make a show about people, just Americans, people who don't often get stories told about them. Yeah, I guess that's sort of my rant on that. I loved working on it, and I loved, sitting in the truck with Paul.
I love that you guys got to go out there together and then meet for the first time, like at a truck stop in Nebraska.
Yeah, you hear it in episode 2.
Yeah. And that, a peek behind the podcast industry scene is we reached out to your company that you work for and said, hey, this is a really great opportunity for us. We think it's a great opportunity for Lacie, and we were able to work out a situation where you were able to work on the show. And I think that speaks to the kind of, there's a real allyship between some of the podcasters out there that want these stories to be told. And I loved how that coordination and collaboration helped inform and allow for your participation as well. So Transmitter Media, thanks to Greta.
I work for a production company in New York City right now called Transmitter Media. You should check out our shows, and shout out to them for allowing me to be part of this.
Okay, let's turn to Ian now. And really you brought the sound and the feel, the essence. You crunched all the interviews and the narration and the field recordings into what we ended up putting out into the feed. And I wonder if you could just talk about how you approached the sound design for the show, and maybe if that changed at all over the course of it, and really like how you reached for balance in all of those components, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess the way I thought about my role throughout was sort of in the terms that you set up in the beginning, Julie. Like the whole show is sort of framed around this sort of balance of insider and outsider perspectives. And if Paul is sort of the consummate insider on this, and Todd and Lacy occupy this sort of border, kind of border crossing zone, I was sort of like on the other end. I was the pure outsider coming to it. Like you, Julie, very ignorant and curious. And I remember when I went and did field recording with Paul in Kentucky, it was like, I met up with him and he had a trucker hat for me, and that was like my camouflage. And he would introduce me to people in the truck stops as his friend from Northern Appalachia, as if that ease the introduction or something, rather than saying I'm a blue-blooded Yankee from Boston. So in any case, when it came to then mixing the episodes, not just mixing, but building the scripts, cutting together Paul's writing with some of the other elements we had gathered, for me it was constantly that back and forth between trying to create something that felt true to Paul and his voice as a storyteller, as a writer, but also something that grabbed my interests aesthetically and topically. And I think the episodes would go back and forth like this. I would sometimes cut together a bunch of tape and sort of like sketch out, how the episode might work. And then Paul might take it and write on it, or maybe he would start with some kind of essay and then I would work in tape around that. And I think where the episodes are, the show is most successful, when it was successful, is when that sort of like coming at it from both sides really met in the middle, and it felt like Paul just telling a story that happens to be scored and smoothly mixed together with field tape and cut sharply, and all those production elements are just sort of working together and serving the story without crowding out the story. And there were certainly moments where it went too far, and Todd or someone would say like, Ian, this sounds like you, this doesn't sound like Paul. I'd be like, yeah, you're right, this does sound like me, this doesn't sound like, and we'd have to sort of go back and retweak and rework it. But it was always that back and forth sort of conceptually between insider and outsider perspectives, and making sure it's something that was both sort of meaningful and relatable, whether you've been driving a truck your whole life or whether you've never seen the inside of a truck.
Yeah, there were so many conversations about what was what was too jargony for trucking and what was
Yeah.
too dumbed down for the drivers. You know, we were really constantly trying to balance that offering and trust listeners to come along and, you know, learn with us or be patient when we needed to sort of maybe be a little more basic about something that most drivers would be all over already. Okay, well, thanks for that. Also, I should point out that Ian created a lot of this sort of recurring stings and transitional sounds and music beds that you would hear throughout. And just, you know, talking a little podcast jargon, we wanted to create a sound, a narrative, like an arc through the whole series that tied it all together sonically. And some of those musical reoccurrences, I think, went a long way to help tie each episode to the next, whether or not, you know, we were bringing characters from one episode to the next or not, but really gave the whole sound design a complete feeling. So
yeah, and that too was sort of Paul and I coming at it from both sides. Like Paul would send me little like demos that he recorded of himself playing guitar in his truck, and then I would take that and maybe add a little keyboard on top of it, or, you know, it was sort of coming at it both ways. But yeah, I think that thematic element was certainly there. There's like the spooky ELD music that comes in every time we talk about how computers are taking over our trucks and our lives.
Yeah. Well, time's getting away. Let's move on into the clips. So what we're going to share is, I asked each of the team to pick a clip from the series that really spoke to them, really stood out, and we all talked about how hard that was to do. But we wanted to present you know, the series presents such a range of drivers, and one of our goals was to point out that truck drivers come in all shapes, colors, sizes, nationalities. Like, there's so much more to the American truck driver than the stereotype leads most people to believe. So you're going to hear a range of the amazing people that we talked to in this series. And, you know, we crested 1 million downloads, so a ton of people have heard these stories. I just want to point of pride, point that out as we go into the listening. And let's start with Paul. Would you like to give us a brief setup and then introduce the clip we're going to share with Theldon?
Sure. So this is Theldon Thornburg Sr. He's a retired trucker and a decorated World War II veteran. And why this tape means so much to me is that other people had asked Theldon if they could come in and record him about his military exploits and all that. For some reason, he let us in. And Theldon goes way back. He used to haul meat for my dad, and his son was my best friend. And he actually passed away during the production of the series. And so it was just, it was just a really memorable and precious time for me to be able to chronicle him, because every time I heard him talk through all the years, I was like, somebody needs to get this on tape before it's too late, you know?
Agree. Just a note, the clips are about 3 to 4 minutes each, and we're going to turn our cameras off while we're listening. We're working on the sound. Sorry about that.
So I stopped by Theldon's house one morning to cook him breakfast.
Now, when did you start driving when you were in the service?
And Theldon tells us his story.
The day I was 21 years old, I got out of the service and I started driving for Ellis Trucking. And I drove there for, I don't know, a year or two. Then I started wildcatting.
Back in the 1950s and 60s, Theldon was one of those independent truckers Finn talked about. But he didn't just haul agricultural products. He was a true wildcatter, meaning he'd haul steel, paper, dry goods, anything he could get in the wagon. And he'd give an under-the-table discount to the freight rates set by the Interstate Commerce Commission. That's what wildcatting was.
Back in them days, there was quite a few wildcatters, and we didn't haul anything that was legal. Everything was illegal. But you could make good money because ICC had high rates on stuff, and you hauled it for cheaper. But if you got caught, you was in trouble.
Theldon had a truck he called Big Al.
Big Al, it was a power liner with 700 or 800 horsepower.
The name was a reference to its rare Allis-Chalmers motor.
They only made 50 of them.
The motor itself was painted all in purple. Truckers called it the Purple People Eater.
In its day, it'd pass anything that was on the road, even if you was overloaded. One time I got arrested at a scale just before you got to the Continental Divide.
He and another driver got busted up there for being overweight.
And me and that guy had breakfast together. I was 5,000 pounds heavier than he was. So he said, I'm going to show you the way up over that Continental Divide. And I said, you do that. So I hung back behind and let him think he was getting a jump on me, you know. When I went past him, I was going about 40 miles an hour faster than he was. And the time I got up over the mountain, I had him out of sight.
But here's what I respect the most about Theldon. Yes, he drove fast. Yes, he broke the rules. But he did those things out of a profound sense of personal responsibility.
I ain't taking nothing to keep me awake except oranges. And that's all I ever did use. I'd buy me a whole pack of big navel oranges down there in Florida. And time I'd get to Sweetgrass, I'd have about 2 left.
In fact, he prided himself on his safety.
If you was wildcatting, you didn't have no insurance, but you was careful.
He was governed by an interior code.
The amount of safety that you got is within yourself, not the truck. And I drove a damn truck 5,200,000 miles and never did have a chargeable accident.
Theldon's voice is just, I remember the first time I heard it and I was just transfixed. And also, if you didn't hear the episode this airs in, it was part of an episode about the history of trucking. And most of the episode is a long form interview with Finn Murphy, another driver who had written a book about his experiences driving. And he and Paul have this really illuminating conversation about kind of the historical trajectory of trucking in America. And then we put this interview sort of in the middle of that to break it up a bit. And I'm struck by how if you think of form and function, Finn's interview told the story and Theldon's conversation with Paul really showed more about some of the history. Paul, thank you for picking that one. Is there anything else you wanted to share about that experience with Theldon? Oh, let's see.
I'm sorry. I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. And bear with me. Okay. Now I'm going to start my video.
Here we go. Yeah.
Okay. So I think the Easter egg was great when where he talks about racing James Dean and how he wasn't very impressed with James Dean and how he beat him in a motorcycle race, and just the ancient rituals of conquest and land speed, and it was, to me, was epic stuff.
Yeah. Also the oranges detail, I think about that all the time, just like bags of oranges in the cab with you. Do you ever travel with oranges down the road for the same reason?
Yeah, so Theldon's son and I, we teamed a load to Alaska one time of tropical plants. And I stopped and I bought a bushel of oranges before we left. Yeah. And he goes, that's exactly how my dad used to stay awake. And it was, oranges will really keep you awake. But I imagine eating a bushel in a 36-hour period all the time would lead to diabetes, as Theldon suggested it did.
All right, well, thank you for that. And we're going to move on to the clip that Lacy selected. Do you want to give us a quick setup, Lacy, for Marcia?
I don't know if it really needs much setup. I guess I will say that it was hard to choose which part of this part of the episode to listen to here. That's just a couple minutes long because I think it's all gold, but it pretty much stands on its own.
Okay, this is from our Long Haul of Fame. I can't even remember the title, where Paul talked to a few of his friends and heroes in the industry.
WSM at that time did not have an overnight personality. And I went straight to the general manager at that time and I said, can we talk?
It's America's trucking sweetheart, Marcia Campbell.
I pitched another program.
City. This is the all-nighter on 650
We're playing music. We're doing This Day in History. We're doing trivia.
Well, a #1 song on this day in...
Tell me when your birthday is. I keep a calendar. It's like, I want to wish everybody a happy birthday. Talking joy, peace, celebration to everyone.
Please slow down and drive with caution. Overnight clear skies.
This is
and a low of 50.
What means so much to me about Marcia. See, after 2001, after 9/11 in particular, like all night trucking radio just turned into constant talk about, all the angst that was going on in the country.
The United States military has begun to crack.
Including local police, the FBI. Well, that's another myth.
And through that, a lot of trucking formats just dropped music altogether. And I personally kind of checked out after that. I'm not hardwired for constant angst, constant umbrage, and that didn't keep me awake. What kept me awake was hearing Jimmy Rogers, Blue Yodel at 3 in the morning. And Marcia, it took her a few years, but she resurrected that format.
The Dixie Chicks with Asleep at the Wheel. Here's Johnny Cash on the all-nighter. We got Chris Stapleton, Billionaire.
And for that reason, if she had never spun one of my songs, I would still consider her a hero.
Nighttime brings out more sensitivity. And if you're joyful, it's magnified. If you're lonesome, if you're sad, if you're hurting, when that sun goes down, it's magnified. But when you know someone cares about you at the other end of the line, whether it's the radio line, the telephone line, because my phone lines are open, call me. If you're struggling, then let's play a game or let's play some music. Let's get you going. It may be that 20 miles or 200 miles. So I learned to be a friend at the other end of the line. And So my callers are honky tonkers, they're truckers, they're gypsies, they're nighttime workers, or it may be Miss Mary that lives down the road who can't sleep at night. She's widowed and she loves country music. So I have the audience that God wants me to have. And I pray that I can be a beacon in the middle of the night. Whoever needs my light or my shine or my heart, my attention, I pray that I can deliver. Long Haul Paul, I wish you happiness and good health, peace and love, and I wish you enough. Godspeed, my friend.
Aw, thank you. Thank you for picking that, Lacie.
You know, listening to it again, I think like I chose that because obviously radio is such, having, you know, grown up in, you know, in the truck with my grandparents and my dad, you know, the radio is such a big part of spending all that time in a cab of a truck. And you know, it's probably somehow part of the reason why I became a radio producer. You know, a lot of us podcasters came from radio first, especially public radio. Shout out Julie, shout out Ian. And I just love that clip because Marcia really, you know, she sort of usurps Paul's hosting position there for a minute, and you really get pulled into her world. And you can hear what it's like and how comforting it is to be listening to her, and you can really put yourself in a driver's position. The way that she speaks to you, Paul, especially, you know, you can really hear the special bond that you two have. Just shortly before that, where that clip starts and that you just heard, we also hear this great bit in which you two are talking about the first time Marcia played one of your songs on her show, which was a huge moment. So, anyway, great episode. We love that episode.
Yeah, she's sort of doing her thing for us right there, and it's both, again, both about what she's talking about and the fact that she's giving it to us right in that moment. That I just find it so powerful. And to get another perspective about the culture, you know, we tried to show as many different ways into this as possible. And I think she brings a really unusual and surprising perspective, is like, what is it like all night on the road when it's dark, and how lonely might you feel? So, I mean, we tell that in a few ways throughout the series, but this one is certainly, she really like puts a pin in it and helps us understand how her listeners are feeling and what she brings to them. Thank you. Okay, moving on, we're going to hear from Ian about his clip that he chose.
Okay. So this one is also from the Hall of Fame episode, and it's sort of a short, sweet, kind of fun clip with a trucker named Idella Hansen. And I think the reason I was just drawn to this, it's one of many, many moments like this that I could have chosen, but it's just one of my favorite things about the show, are these, when we'd be out talking to somebody in an interview and, you know, we'd have maybe a list of questions or something we were hoping to get at, but inevitably Paul would just go off script and start just, you know, telling stories and riffing and like just doing his thing, and just stuff would happen in these interviews that, you know, was not planned, and are things that would have, you know, I interviewed Idella for hours and, you know, would not have gone the same places, would not have drawn out the same stories. And it all comes back to that connection that they have, you know, through, you know, practicing the same trade for their, you know, so many years of their lives. So I think this is just a wonderful kind of intimate moment between them, and a really fun, intimate moment that came out in this interview.
Well, should we get into the episode?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So the first hero and mentor and friend is Idella Marie Hansen.
My name is Idella Marie Hansen, and I'm 69 years old. What was that other thing? Oh, wait a minute.
How many years have you been trucking?
52 years. I've been driving 52 years. Can't you tell? My memory's gone.
She's an interesting lady.
I get up in the morning, and I get in that seat. I'd give that little wiggle, and I'm ready for my day.
Idella is the ultimate badass trucker chick. She hauls money for a living, and she wears a gun.
Oh, it's empowering. Who in the hell gives a 64-year-old woman a gun that never shot a gun before in her life? You know, are you nuts or something? You know, and I just make it a habit when they ask me, well, what are you hauling? I just tell them, you know better than to ask that. And you need to step away from the truck.
Can you give me your step away from the truck thing?
You need to step away from the truck.
That puts the fear of God in me right now.
Now ask me again. What are you hauling? You don't need to ask me that question, sir. You're going to need to step away from the truck. What's going on here is none of your business. You need to move on, and you need to move on now.
So just imagine that. 64 years old, I think I'll just start hauling money and carrying a gun around. Do you ever, if I hauled money and if I wore a gun, I'm afraid I would like stand in front of the mirror in the Flying J and say, freeze! Pull the gun out of the holster, freeze! Do you ever do that? I mean, do you ever just stand in front of the mirror?
Now, we do have to do that. Stop.
I'm guessing many people have the same reaction. I just have to laugh out loud when I hear that scene. And I've heard it a dozen times at least. I still am grinning along with her saying that. I'm sure you're saying it and laughing.
I feel like I would smile and laugh out loud. I mean, no matter how many times I went through that section.
Yeah.
I couldn't help myself.
And that kind of speaks to, we really did reach for across different emotions with this. We didn't want it to be a one-note show that only talked about things in a certain way. And I think it was like little scenes like this that really brought, a lot of the humor and camaraderie that Paul, you told us the whole time you were finding out on the road, and some of those connections with your fellow drivers.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move into our last clip. Todd is going to set us up. It's from our episode, Our Punjabi Brothers, toward the end of the season. You want to give us just some background, and then we'll hop right into listening?
Yeah, sure. The episode was about the Punjabi American community among drivers, particularly on the West Coast in California, but there are pockets of Punjabi American communities all around the country, and a lot of the episode focused on a series of protests in the year 2017 ahead of the electronic logging device mandate that I covered at the time, and what you're about to hear is two men talking about those protests from different sides of the country. The first one is the gentleman that sort of led us through this entire episode, more or less. His name is Ben Apple out in California, and then the second is owner operated by the name of Mike Landis, who participated in the protest, but from D.C., Washington D.C., which was a little bit of a smaller effort. That was kind of where I saw the protests from firsthand back during that time. It covered some of what happened in California in the aftermath a little bit, but what you hear here is this kind of this perspectives on a phenomenon that resulted that had nothing to do really with the regulation necessarily that was being didn't have a lot to do anyway with the regulation that was being talked about during these protests, being highlighted, but had to do more with just how two disparate groups among truckers related amongst themselves, and it kind of it's something that I wrote about at the time too. But for me, it kind of reverberates in the trucking world. As a guy that writes for a trucking magazine, this feels almost like one of the most important things that Over the Road kind of illustrated definitely in this episode, but throughout all the others as well. It just means a lot to me that we were able to do that. So let's hear it.
There's an interesting coda to this story, though, which is how those protests affected the trucking community itself. In a way, this may be the most lasting impact of Operation Black and Blue.
Before we did the Black and Blue, the Punjabi truckers got hardly any respect from if you think truckers is predominantly Caucasian, right? Like white males that are drivers. And they were like the old school truckers, and they called the Indians ragheads, diaper heads, Arabs, and you name it, they called them that. But after the Black and Blue, after, the 1,000+ showing, they started calling us the Punjabi brothers, the Sikh brothers. There'll be like Facebook posts and stuff, and people would say something bad about a Sikh or a Punjabi. And before a Sikh or a Punjabi responded, you got like 20 white people responding like, hey, they're not all like that. We met these people. They're good. They got the same problem as us.
One of those changed hearts belonged to our old friend, Mike Landis. When we interviewed Mike for our very first episode at the truck show, he told us how his own attitude towards the Sikh and Punjabi drivers has changed.
Having grown up watching 9/11 on a TV in biology class, to me, if someone had a big beard, looked Middle Eastern, and had a turban on their head, they were crap. That was the wrong way to look at it. I knew it deep down, but just always stuck in my head.
Right up until the ELD protests began.
I went to D.C. in October of 17, and we decided to go to Constitution and talk to the public.
The same week that Binda and company were organizing the rolling protest in California, Mike and a few dozen or so other truckers parked their rigs along Constitution Avenue near the White House. But a group of Punjabi drivers showed up in D.C. too, and when one of the leaders stepped out of his truck with the full turban and beard, Mike was, impressed.
And I'm thinking of myself, and I'm like, man, if I was in a place where most people probably looked at me and were like, oh my God, and he's still getting out wearing that because he's proud to wear it, and he's here with us, that kind of says a lot.
And just like in California, the East Coast Punjabis had completely out-organized every other faction of truckers.
He had put together with a few of the others these vans and stuff that went around to the different states and picked up all these different Sikh and Punjabi drivers and stuff. And they brought us food. They would walk up to us and shake our hand and thank us for being there with our trucks. They outnumbered us 4-1, I guarantee you.
Really?
They asked me like, hey, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, I'm from Lidditz. And they're like, oh yeah, us too. I'm like, what?
Really?
Here they own the pizza joint down the street from my house. At the end of it, I was sitting on a bench looking at the Washington Monument, and this whole thing has just been this crazy, weird, emotional, eye-opening, like you're already there fighting for something you believe in, kind of, and then, I've always had this idea of these people and just totally feel like a complete piece of crap for having this idea for so long in my life. We talk to them, they want some type of action because they come from areas of the world where if they try and protest, they're liable to be killed, for one, and for two, they've been in a suppressed type of situation where they're like, you have the opportunity to fight for something that's right, like that's your right as a citizen here to be able to do that, and you're not going to stand up and do it? Are you crazy? And they're 100% right.
Thank you too, Todd, for sharing that clip. It's ever timeless and timely in ways we couldn't have known that conversations about racism in this country would be right now. And it's an important angle on that as well.
I really appreciate both of those, Binda Atwal and Mike Landis there, for just that the candor that you hear there, and and just but both of them, they sort of they're of the age of where they kind of they're younger. Ben Atwell's gotten out of trucking, frankly, but both of them are of the age that represent kind of what's coming, among the trucking community. They're young, they're in their 30s, whereas a lot of truck drivers, and particularly truck owner operators, are much older than that. And so, to hear the candor between the two of them and describing this phenomenon, it's just it gives me chills every time I hear it, frankly. But yeah.
I wanted to note that it's 5:30. We got a little bit of a late start, and with the technical difficulties, we're going to go about 10 or 15 minutes more. I hope you'll stay with us because we've got a very special treat at the end that I think you'll want to stick around for. And I want to get to some questions. And I just want to say something about that last clip that I also find really interesting is we had recurring characters across some of the episodes, although mostly they were their own stories. And Mike was in the first episode, and he's in this one, and then we do a wrap up at the end. One thing about making a podcast across 15 months when you are trying to follow news happening is that it changes. And when we laughed because we had the last episode kind of in the can months in advance, and then we had to keep updating it because our drivers were in different situations. And so I think, this ELD was an issue. One of my big takeaways from the series is learning about the ELD because it came up in every episode. It wasn't just the issue about the ELD, it was how it affected every aspect of drivers' lives. And it was really interesting to me to see which threads we could pull through from the beginning of the series through the whole thing. And so, I feel like this clip really speaks to that as well. Okay, you guys ready to answer some questions? Spend a few minutes on that. Let me flip over to questions. My Radiotopia colleagues, Aaron, is helping wrangle some of them. Okay, I'll start because I saw a bunch of these. Any chance of a second season? We're not opposed to a second season. It's just, it took a lot of time and effort and some money to make the first one. So we're all thinking about it. And I think, if it was up to us, we'd just hop right into it, but there's other considerations. But don't give up. The conversation is not completely dead. Okay, what was the best part of recording and what was the biggest bummer? Maybe Paul and Ian, you could talk about that.
Go ahead, Ian.
I mean, getting out in the field and on the road with Paul and sometimes Todd as well was just a joy. And actually, Lacy did more of the riding along in the truck than I did even. But just I think the highlight for me was doing the tour of the Kentucky truck stops. We hit up, there's 3, if you listen to episode 4, 3 stops in Kentucky, we hit up those 3 truck stops in one day, and we got 3 rib sticking meals in the span of a few hours, as part of insinuating ourselves into each of these settings. And it was a lot of fun. We met some really interesting characters and had some good fun on the CB radio while we were at it. So that was definitely the highlight. Paul?
Yeah, the Kentucky episode stands out because we remember, Ian, we only had approval to talk to one of those stops, and we just sauntered into the other ones. And It's almost, they weren't going to do anything with you over the phone until you just showed up.
Yeah.
And
we've been working the phones for months trying to get somebody to just say, yes, you can come and interview us, and nothing doing. Yeah.
So one Karen Bray gave us permission, but she couldn't really remember me. And remember when she was like, oh, I know you. Yeah. And it was like, come on.
You're nobody until you step in the door.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're an old friend.
Yeah, exactly. And they go by your face. They just, what she said, they go by your face. I think the biggest bummer, and this is the nature of the beast, but how much wonderful stuff has to wind up on the cutting room floor.
Yeah.
I wrote a letter to Professor Bailey, who gave us a wonderful interview. And I said, editing interviews, it's just like throwing children off a lifeboat. You know, it's just so painful. You have to be brutal. You have to be ruthless, because, you know, you're asking people to give you 45 minutes of their time. Yeah. And that's the part that it bothered me somewhat. But there's nothing you can do about it. That's, again, it's just part of the deal.
Yep. And I mean, not to dwell on the negative, but, you know, as you referenced in the credits of the last episode, there was a moment when this whole project nearly went up in flames about a year ago now. And that was, I think, what we came back to that day when Paul, Julie, and I were sitting around trying to figure out how we resurrect this thing. It was, you know, for all those voices we had recorded and those people we had interviewed, we could not, in good conscience, let this thing just go by for their sake. And so we managed to put our differences aside, and like you said, it's like a pair of Red Wing shoes. Nice and cozy.
Oh, this is kind of interesting. We probably might all answer it differently. What were some of the topics that almost made it onto the show, and then we had to ultimately let go of for one reason or another? Can you guys remember any?
What was episode 6 originally supposed to be? Yeah, remember? Because it wasn't going to originally be about the Punjabi American community until I think it was you kept sort of pressing on that, and I was like, you know, that's a great story there. So yeah.
Was it? I remember there being like a dark side episode.
That would have been it. Yeah, that would have been dark sides. Yes.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions about sex trafficking and you know, the role of trucking and the role of truck drivers standing up against that, and it just it was always on the, like, if we have the time and the space to come back maybe in the next season to tackle that one, because it's big. It's a really big story to tackle. Anyone think of anything else?
That was the one I was thinking of. That sort of sexuality, sex work, sex traffic. There was a whole sort of like locus of issues that I feel like we touched on in some in episodes and never really made the time to take head on, which is too bad. But maybe there'll be another chance.
That is intentional, because we were saying, well, how is trucking depicted across popular culture anyway? You know, and how can we tell the stories that aren't already being out there told? Even though I think we would tell the stories differently and in our own way.
Oh yeah.
Drawn to the stories you're not hearing as much versus the ones that Hollywood is all over the place with.
Right. But the full episode is what we kept coming back to with that subject.
Also, Paul, you wrote this. There are a few essays that Paul wrote that also ended up on the cutting room floor. There's one about a truck stop chapel in Kentucky. That was a wonderful
You can find that one
story.
on overdriveonline.com.
Yeah, and there's also an essay that Paul wrote about that Lodi team to Alaska.
Yeah.
That was also at one point going to be part of an episode, and that is a wonderful. There are just these wonderful stories that they're all still in a document in a folder somewhere. So maybe something will come of them.
Maybe so. Let's have thumbs up or down from the team. Would you recommend trying nan or nanner pudding?
Of course.
I've got to say, the nanner pudding was a bit of an anticlimax for me. It was like, it's nothing but sizzle. It's nothing but sizzle and mystique.
This question we got so many times from listeners. You know, one of the things we did was we created a hotline that anybody could listen and call in with their questions. And we had, Aaron probably knows the exact number. We had probably 150 or 200 questions called in. And I think like a quarter of them were about, you know, can you do this in the car? Is it distracting? Is it annoying? So let's have the ultimate authority on the subject weigh in here, Paul. What is your take on the honking signal?
Okay, there are rules to the honk your horn. a female, if I'm on the interstate, I will honk my horn for a female of any age. But if you are a male past puberty, if you're a dude with a beard doing this, I'm just assuming, no, man, you had your time in childhood. It's over. You don't want to honk your horn in town, but you got to be on the interstate, okay? You got to be on the interstate. And so, yeah, I just honked my horn for someone. In fact, I'm going to honk my horn. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Watch this. See, for all y'all. That's for all y'all.
Worth noting that Idella Hansen's policy on horn honking is far more liberal. She will honk the horn for anyone, regardless of age.
Yeah.
She's all about it.
I might run a little bit of a tighter ship on that. I just don't know. If you're a grown man, why are you honk my horn?
Okay, we're running to the end of our time, and as I said, we've got a special treat for you. I'm gonna explain. One person had a question about Radiotopia, how we decide between creating standalone shows versus a showcase season. And I'll say it's an experiment. We felt like we wanted to build this one out and have these extra components. It would be very visual. We're working with this external team that it just felt like it could stand its own series. And we are learning ourselves about what we can do as a network. So we're going to keep Showcase going. There'll be more Showcases. And if you don't know what Showcase is, it's a podcast from Radiotopia that puts in finite series. So we could have put 8 episodes of Over the Road into Showcase, but we wanted to experiment with what it would be like to design something from scratch and do the full independent feed for Over the Road. Okay, but let's end on a trucking question instead of a podcast question. Let's see. Let's see, sorry, getting through. I think those are ones we've already answered. Okay, here's a very technical one. Paul, in one of your songs, and kudos to whoever asked this for listening so closely, you talk about triple digits. Do trucks really run 100 miles per hour plus?
Well, I've not done that in a long time, but I used to work for a guy who had triple digit trucks. And the only reason why someone puts you in a triple digit truck is he expects you to run that way sometimes if you've got a hot load of produce. And I want to say, I know it sounds really reckless to go 100 miles an hour in a truck, but there's something that happens to the Caterpillar motor at 100 miles an hour. It gets quiet and it purrs, and it's like the most transcendent feeling you can ever have if you're in western Kansas at 5 in the morning going 100 miles an hour chasing a cow truck. But I've not done that in a really long time. In fact, I have a clean driving record, and I'm not that person anymore.
Awesome.
And it's not good for your tires either.
Could it be?
Tires are rated for 75, but anyways.
Yeah. It's been 25 years since it's been 15 years since I've driven like that.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we have come to the end of the listen-in. I think we could keep talking for hours and answering questions. So I've got a little housekeeping, and then we're going to do one more thing. Mostly, I just want to thank you all for joining us for this conversation, and to the Radiotopia producers for helping us promote the show all along. My fellow Radiotopia team, Audrey, Aaron, Marielle, Charlotte, and Dave. Please, to everyone on the call, continue to share this show with people you think will like it. And make sure you follow what Paul's up to with his music and what Todd's writing about on Overdrive. And I'm sure Lacey's about to launch another excellent podcast. We'll be helping share some of these links through the Over the Road feed for the next couple more weeks, the social channels. I also want to let you know about one other Radiotopia relevant event happening later this week. Ear Hustle, the Ear Hustle crew is going to join the PRX Podcast Garage team for a wind down where they'll share clips from the show and talk about it. And this is happening Thursday from 5:30 to 6:30 Eastern. We've just posted a link to that in the chat, and you can find out more on the Podcast Garage website. podcastgarage.org. Look for the virtual calendar. We're going to keep pulling these listen-ins together because there's like nothing more enjoyable to me in the whole world than listening to audio with a group of people. So I hope you'll come back for more listen-ins in the future. And I think this brings us to our last hurrah. Paul, would you care to sing us out here?
Mama said to me, son, you know you could become whatever you want to be. So by my old girl so brown, it hurts me somehow for her to see what became of me. See, at 19 years old, I was dressed in bold in the highway, call me one day. Now it's down in my blood and it rolls like blood and it takes everything in its way. Now I'm working over the road, working over the road. So you work day and night, you learn how to fight till one day you stand on your own. For the strength that you find, you pay dearly in kind in the love that you leave back at home. So I sought for a space for to see the sweet faces of the loved ones I hold dear. And it's changed me to say after 2 or 3 days, the old highway was all I could hear. Now I'm working over the road, working over the road, over the road. Someday they die in old flannel grave. On their quiet silk ties at the break of day. And they say to their sons, you will be as I am. Ah, but God bless the young who dream one day they'll stand. Working over the road, working over the road, over the road. When the road knows around her, some they would squander their souls and to stand by the sweat of the brow, the dirt on their hands, working over the road, working over the road, over the road, working over the road, over the road, over the road.
Hey, thank you so much, Paul. And again, thanks to the team for gathering for this celebration of the show and to everyone who listened. And have a wonderful rest of your day and hope to see you back for another listen in sometime soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Radiotopia
from PRX.